All right, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm here with Janice Kortkamp. We are talking about the Syrian crisis, and I usually tend to introduce my guests, but I want to allow Janice to introduce herself, because Janice, I want you to give sort of a background about who you are and how you came to be interested in Syria, how you came to be opposed to the intervention in Syria. So if you don't mind introducing yourself and just telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to be where you are in terms of your views on the Syrian crisis.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on, Brandon. I appreciate this opportunity. I am just a regular American. I have studied history all my life and archaeology and anthropology, and as the Arab Spring was happening, I just felt that it seemed too good to be true. It seemed a little fishy to me. And so I decided that it was time to really dig in and try to get some kind of grasp on the Middle East and what was happening there. This was towards the end of 2012. And as I was researching what had happened in Libya and knew that President Assad of Syria was supposed to be the next brutal tyrant to fall in front of the Arab Spring uprising, I noticed that President Assad had given an interview with RT, Sofia Shahnazi. And so I decided to kind of grit my teeth and watch a few minutes of this interview to see this brutal tyrant trying to justify his actions against his own people. So I started watching that interview, and I was shocked, because literally in about 3 minutes, I just had a gut feeling that this man was telling the truth. So I finished watching the interview. I watched it again. I showed it to my husband, my children, my friends. I said, I think we're missing something here, because this man sounds quite articulate, and he's telling his side of the story very well. And I became obsessed with finding out about the conflict and what was really going on there, and just started diving in, and I took points from that interview and researched those individual points. I just started seeking any source of information that I could find. But he had said something in the interview that was intriguing to me. He said, anyone can be president in Syria. And I was born in Syria, and I'll die in Syria. I'm Syrian. And it kind of made me wonder, what's so special about Syria? I honestly knew nothing about the country. So in addition to researching the war and the political and military conflict, I also started researching Syria itself as a country, its culture, its history, etc. And so this became quickly an obsession for me, and literally I spent all day, every day, for the next 4.5 years researching Syria and learning about the country and learning about the war. But also what made a huge difference for me was I realized that for the first time in history, I, sitting in my house, could reach across the ocean and be in contact with people on the ground in Syria, and I could simply ask them what was going on in their country through Facebook and Skype and methods like that. So that's what I did, and I just started kind of reaching out to these Syrian groups about the war, and just started kind of making contacts with individuals over there. And those contacts, many of them became very deep friendships. And I was just trying to get a sense of the reality on the ground. And after 3.5 years of that, I felt quite confident that I knew the situation. I knew enough about Syria, but I felt that I really had to get on the ground there to see if what I thought matched reality. And so I determined to go. And I was able to get a visa. It was very difficult. I have since now been on 3 trips to Syria. I've spent 3 months there in total over the last 12 months. and have learned so much and just keep wanting to go back, as so many of us do who go. It's a spectacular country, and the people are the best. They are amazing, and I love being there, and I just can't wait to get back there.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I wanted you to touch on, and you hit upon it earlier, was that there's something incredibly special about Syria, not just as a conflict, but as a country and as a culture and as the people. I traveled to the Middle East myself, and didn't make it into Syria, but I managed to talk to many Syrian refugees and Syrians in Lebanon, and found the same thing. It's just incredibly special people. It's hard to put into words when you come back here to describe, but maybe you can. So I want to give you the opportunity, and if you're able to maybe tell some stories about some of the people that you met there.
Sure, I would love to. And it is hard to describe. But, for example, I remember before I went, I read an account of an American who had traveled there before the war. And he said, I felt like the Syrians always had my back. And that I found again and again. It was, of course, one of the fastest-growing tourist destinations in the world prior to the violence erupting there. But one story, for example, I had, on my very first trip, I had flown from Kuwait into the Damascus airport, and I had somebody waiting for me outside the airport, but I had to get from the plane through security, et cetera, to get out to meet the person who was meeting me. So I got off the plane, walked up to the immigration counter, and the guy at the counter is looking at my American passport, and this is extraordinary for an American to be traveling in Syria that's not a journalist. So he's looking at my visa, he's looking at the passport, and he looks up at me and he says, very sternly, kind of, what is your occupation? And I was so happy to finally be there. I gave him a huge smile, and I said, I'm a housewife. And he just warmed up to me immediately. He called over a very kind gentleman who spoke better English than he did, Mr. Mohammed. And Mr. Mohammed took my hand up to the front of the line to get my bags. He got me through customs. He got me through security, and, deposited me safely on the other side of the airport. Throughout the entire flight, all through the airport, I just felt like what I had thought was going to be true about Syria, I was going to find was true about Syria. It's an adage there that there were few hotels there because wherever you go, people are forever asking you, if you meet them, they want to take you to their home for coffee and sweets or to stay at their house, and they're famous for their extraordinary hospitality. And this was true wherever I went. For example, I went to Homs. I was in desperate need for a haircut, and the lady whose house I was staying at had arranged for me to get a haircut. And so we get there, and first she's going to pay for my haircut, but the owner of the salon would hear none of it, and they were just so thrilled that an American was there visiting them, standing beside them, seeing the reality on the ground. And this just happened again and again throughout the country. Everywhere I went, I was greeted with, "You are most welcome in Syria." And I was cared for. I was protected. People say, "Don't you feel afraid? Isn't it dangerous?" And yes, there are dangers there, but honestly, I cannot say that I ever felt afraid. I felt very well cared for, and I felt like, so many of these people that I just met in random encounters really became friends. And the Syrian people are brilliant. They're very witty, very sharp-witted. They tell great jokes. They are great company. They're artistic, poetic, philosophical. deep thinkers. Most of them are highly educated, and they're just great company. It's a joy to be spending time with them.
Yeah, and from some of the Syrians that I know, I was even told that when you go to Syria, if you meet somebody and they invite you to their home to go to dinner, it's legitimate. They mean it, and you should just go. It's not exactly what it's like here, where we maybe invite people out to things or invite them over in hopes that they won't show up, or it's legitimate, and it's part of the culture. And I've noticed the same thing in terms, you mentioned the highly educated nature of the people. I mean, I found the same thing, that they know more about American history than Americans do, and they know more about American politics than Americans do.
Exactly.
Obviously they're a bit confused when, if you're an outsider looking into the United States, it is an absolute sideshow, but they know more about what is happening than Americans do. And the Syrian sense of humor is also something that I appreciate, because I often make jokes that people don't get, and as some of my listeners will be well acquainted with, and the Syrians tend to understand a joke when it's made, and they can make some good ones themselves.
Well, they're extraordinary people, and over the course of the war, too, they have such a sharp sense of, how can I put this, they kind of look into your eyes, and there's almost like an immediate connection that will form. What they're looking for is, are you genuine? Are you good-willed? Do you come as a friend? And this happened again and again, even at Army checkpoints. There was one time I was leaving Damascus on the road to Homs, and there's a major checkpoint outside of Damascus. And I was sitting in the car while my friend and guide took the paperwork in for the permissions for me to travel. And next thing I knew, the colonel himself of the checkpoint had come out, and he was standing beside the cabin, motioning me to get out of the car. And I got out, and he was this soldier with these bright, penetrating blue eyes, just an incredibly intense man. And he held out his hand. I shook his hand, and he held on to my hand, and he's looking at me in the eye, and he just said, "Thank you. You are welcome here in Syria. God bless you for being here and coming to my country." And he invited me in for coffee, and the soldiers there were telling me their stories. And one of those guys was one of the men who had been at Malula when the terrorists came into Malula, and he was injured in the explosion when the suicide bomber blew himself up at the checkpoint there. And so they're just wonderful men. I found out when I got home, about a month after I got back from that a terrorist had blown up that checkpoint, and the colonel and his men were gone. But when I was there with him, and he was looking at me, and he said, "Please go back to your country and tell the people there that they've been lied to about Syria." And he was telling me what was going on, the things that I knew, and I promised him that I would. And when I found out he had been killed, there was just something in me that became like steel. I do not care what anybody says. I don't care about anybody's opinion. I am going to share the side of the story that I know, regardless of any accusations or blah, blah, blah that comes up against me. This is something that has to be shared.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've noticed, is that, for Syrians, they don't seem to fully understand why Americans aren't up in arms. It's, I don't, again, that is hard to put into words, but one of the things people would ask me about what do Syrians think of Americans. And again, I've never been in Syria, but I had the chance to talk to them. And I have many connections in Syrians, that I know who are outside of Syria. And you can correct me if I'm wrong if you get a different perception, but the idea is that they expect more. They expect better of the American people. And when I say expect, they actually expected it. They expected us to oppose this war, that we would be out in the streets protesting and doing whatever we could to stop it. And, of course, that's not what Americans have done. I'm not sure if we can even say we have an anti-war movement, even a small one. And I don't think they understand why that's the case. I don't think they understand the level to which Americans have been brainwashed, literal brainwashing through media and through other channels. And it's actually hard to get that across to people.
It's brutally hard, yeah.
And as you said, the colonel that you talked to wanted you to come back and tell Americans that they'd been lied to, which of course is what you're trying to do. And it's hard to break the news, for one thing, to somebody in that situation that we've been trying to do that, and it's like screaming at a brick wall. At least it is for me. And again, I'm amazed at the forgiveness that they show. I mean, can you imagine if a foreign country had funded a revolution of savages who, and we'd lost half of our family in the most brutal fashion, and then someone comes from that country to basically, tour our country and get to know us. I don't think Americans would have the same response of being able to separate this other country and their government and their people the way Syrians do, because Syrians are very angry at America, at the government, but they're quite forgiving when it comes to the American people. The reaction that you got when you entered Syria, to me that's quite amazing.
Well, you described it very well, and it actually was Syria and Syrians who taught me to separate myself from my government. I wish that I had been wise enough to oppose our wars prior to this. I had also allowed myself, especially after 9/11, to become brainwashed, and had, there was a part of me that looked at people in the Middle East as our enemies, blah, blah, blah. But it's Syrians themselves saying to me over and over again, you are not your government. We want to pretend that we're a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But as far as foreign policy goes, there is literally no connection. Americans are considered the good-willed people. Syrians love Americans, truly, but they consider us to be pretty ignorant of foreign affairs and events in the world, as you described. In fact, I was walking the streets of Damascus with Carla Ortiz, and she's a Bolivian filmmaker who's producing a documentary about Syria. And she stopped these two little girls. They were like 10 or 11 and 12. And she was interviewing one of them who spoke English beautifully. And this little 12-year-old girl had us all open-mouthed. She was so articulate and eloquent and so knowledgeable about the United States and about world regional events and what was going on in her country. And we all just felt like cheering when she was done. And I want to elect her to some office because she's just an extraordinary person. And again, as you said, the people there, one thing I would say is I think for the most part they are aware that we are so utterly brainwashed. But they assumed, especially after 6 years, that we would be questioning more. And people here are not even questioning it. We don't question, and I'm not talking about everyone. There are quite a few people who are awake here. But we're not questioning these wars and interventions. We're not questioning the narratives, no matter how absurd they might be. The idea that Saudi Arabia is helping us to bring freedom and democracy to Syria should have had Western journalists rolling in the aisles. This is completely impossible. There are no human rights, there's no freedom, and there's no democracy in Saudi Arabia. They won't allow it in their country. That's the last thing they want to bring to Syria. If you had to compare the two countries with something that Americans would understand, Saudi Arabia is the Flintstones and Syria is the Jetsons. They're light years ahead of
exactly
the Saudis in terms of religious freedom and empowerment for women. Their culture is so deep. Their civilization goes back to the dawn of civilization. And I think this is something that allows them to be a little more gracious to us, or much more gracious to us than we are or would be to them, is that they are an ancient civilization, and comparing us to them, we're like babies in diapers. We are an infant nation. We really, have a lot to learn. In fact, I was talking with one friend there, and he gave me a beautiful story. He's a filmmaker there in Syria, and he was with a German team before the war on an archaeological dig in northeast Syria. And they were all housed by this little old Syrian lady, and she was giving them the Syrian hospitality treatment. I mean, just this glorious, deep hospitality. And the Germans were kind of like, very, they wanted things done very quickly. They didn't want to linger over their meals, whatever. And the Syrian documentary maker kind of apologized to her on their behalf because they were a little bit rude and brusque. And she said, "Oh, no worries. They come from a very young country." And to me, that was a beautiful illustration of what we're seeing. The Syrians very graciously have, they are upset at the American people not waking up by now, not speaking out, and still to this day, after 6 years of war, they receive you with smiles and sometimes with tears at the thought that people actually went to Syria and put their lives at risk to be there to stand beside them. They're dear, precious people, and no country deserves what's happening in Syria. But to have it happen there is just utterly heartbreaking.
Yeah, I think you're right, and as you said, it's overwhelming to see somebody who's lost their family members, lost their livelihood, lost their homes, actually come up to you and thank you just for coming and just for speaking out. I mean, that's something that you can't really put into words. It's extremely humbling. It's almost embarrassing to be the recipient of that.
Exactly.
But the idea, I mean, that Americans have had of the Middle East and thus of Syria, one of the things that I get all the time is, it's why would these people be fighting over sand, right? It's just a bunch of sand because that's all they see on TV is sand. Well, maybe Saudi Arabia, but Syria, that's not the case at all. It's not the case in Lebanon. It's not the case in other places. And one of the things that I hear the most, I'm sure you hear it all the time too, is that maybe the position is decent to just leave people alone, which is what pretty much everybody wants the United States to do, is leave people alone. But the idea, well, these people have been fighting over there for 1,000 years, and nothing's going to stop them. I've heard that if I had a nickel for every time I've heard that, I could finance, a trip across the entire Middle East with that money. And it's infuriating to hear that because, first of all, they haven't. Syria has not been fighting for 1,000 years. They've been fighting for 6, and we started it. And last time I checked, when I was growing up, Europe was fighting. And I'm 33 years old, so before we get on our high horse, but that's the idea that people have of Syria is that it's a big bunch of rocks and sand where primitive backwards people are constantly fighting over religion, and that is the hardest thing. Well, not the hardest, but one of the hardest things to break through to people is that none of that is true. And you can. I don't want to monopolize this here. I want to let you tell people what you saw in terms of how people interacted with each other in terms of religion, whether it's Christian, Jew, Muslim, Shiites, Sunni, Druze, whatever. My knowledge of the situation is that everybody has gotten along just fine, and still are. The only people who can't get along with the people of other religions are the people that get paychecks from the United States and Saudi Arabia.
Well, everything that you said is true. First off, Syria is a gorgeous country, as you mentioned. There are snow-capped mountains. There are beautiful rolling hills. There are fertile fields as far as the eye can see. There is a substantial, we would call it a desert. They say it's a steppe that I love. It's a real Martian landscape. There is a beautiful seaside coast, huge, modern, productive, vibrant cities that embrace their ancient cores, like in old Damascus. Unfortunately, the old cities of Aleppo and Homs were terribly damaged over the course of this conflict. And the reason why Syria has been fought over by empires, as long as there have been empires, it was fought over by the Egyptians and the Hittites, is that it is a jewel. It's a jewel that at the crossroads of the world, so north, south, east, and west, it's right at the epicenter. It's not all about gas and oil like people want to believe. That's a huge factor. But for, location, Syria is the epicenter. The civilization and the culture there is traditionally one of tolerance and getting along with one another. And I would say that it is unique, really, in the depth of mutual respect that, especially before the war, had existed. For example, I can't tell you how, there was a substantial Jewish population there prior to about in the 1970s, and there's still a few families there left. But in the old Jewish quarter, I had friends that just longed for the days when they, as children, and these are people who are Sunnis, Alawites, Christians, etc., they would go to the Jewish quarter, and the Jewish ladies would have them on Saturday do little jobs for them because it was the Jewish Sabbath. And then the Jewish ladies would give them cookies and sweets for doing these little tasks for them. And so that was a big treat for them, was to go to the Jewish quarter. One of the people that went with me on one of my trips is a Jewish man from California, and he had such a wonderful time there and was so beautifully received and befriended by people that he was crying when he left, and he would love to live there. The Christians and the Muslims, the Grand Mufti of Syria, for example, describes Syria as being a country of 23 million Christians. The Archbishop of one of the churches says, we're a country of 23 million Muslims, and there's this brotherly love. For example, Christmas is perhaps, from most Syrians, I would even say, their favorite time of year, whether they're Muslims or Christians, and everyone looks forward to that time. There are Christmas celebrations all throughout Syria, and when Aleppo, this past Christmas, was finally liberated and freed of the terrorist groups that the U.S. and our allies have supported in East Aleppo, the first thing they did was hold a huge Christmas celebration. And a former ambassador from Britain to Syria, Peter Ford, said that would not have happened had Aleppo fallen completely into the hands of the rebels. The Christians often would hold iftars, post-Ramadan meals for their Muslim friends, etc. This is something that the whole world can learn from. And one of the things that was the most painful to come to understand was that the United States deliberately nurtured and fomented sectarian hatred in Syria. They worked with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood, Turkey, etc., to literally create false propaganda to grow hatred and distrust and suspicion between the different religious groups there, and to literally build up these extremists and fanatics, and to make them think that President Assad was going to kill them all, he was going to wipe out the Sunnis, and again, it's totally absurd. His wife is a Sunni. The majority of the army are Sunni. The majority of the government are Sunnis. So this is something that as a country is perhaps one of the greatest evils we've been involved with there, and it's going to take a long time to heal some of those wounds.
You mentioned the scene from Aleppo. I watched that at Christmas as they lit the Christmas tree, and everybody was donning Santa caps and stuff like that. So I, took that and showed it to many people who looked at it and thought, and actually said to me, "Wow, they celebrate Christmas over there." They're normal people. Big surprise, right? They have Santa caps and Christmas trees at Christmas. And, Peter Ford's right. It wouldn't have happened had these areas fallen to the terrorists. And, in fact, it didn't happen. As long as East Aleppo was under the control of them, these things didn't happen. I believe this was the first Christmas, public Christmas celebration that they had in the area since the terrorists took over. And that there's that. But I also want to ask you too. You've been to Syria 3 times, so in the last 12 months, a lot has taken place over the last 12 months. So, is there a difference that you've seen from the first time you went versus, because you just got back recently? Yes. Is there a difference that you noticed in the situation there on the ground, in the people and their outlook? What are the differences that you noticed from your first trip to this last trip?
Well, it's, the people there are as resolute as ever. But they're tired of this. They really are just fed up with it. They're sick of the war. They want it over. For example, I was able to observe the evacuation of terrorists from the Al-War neighborhood of Homs. And this was a neighborhood that had, before the war, had 250,000 people in it. Again, people of different faiths living together, etc. The rebels had taken it over, the so-called rebels. Most of the people left. Many of them went into the government-held area of Homs. And literally, this pocket of terrorists had, many of them were not from the neighborhood. They'd come in from other parts of Syria, even from outside of Syria. So there were about 50,000 people still living in Al-War. Some of them were just civilians, and about 5,000 or so, about 14,000, people who were militants and their families, who were terrorists and their families. And these terrorists literally had besieged Homs for years. They would launch mortar attacks, suicide bombings. They would sit on the highway and snipe people in their cars driving on the highway. They were just a monstrous source of constant attacks against civilians. And yet, when the BBC went in there, they also observed the evacuation, and they were lamenting about how the Syrians and the Russians were forcing these poor little residents to leave their homes. And in fact, those terrorists had taken over the homes of people who actually did leave there, who they forced out, and they've been literally attacking people daily. And yet the BBC reporter is just so saddened that they had to get on a bus and go to Idlib. I think I lost the thread of your original question. I kind of
well, you can continue. Yeah, the BBC is it's an absolute joke. I forgot what they were calling this. It was not a population swap or something. They were trying to imply that Assad was forcibly relocating people for the purposes of changing the demographics of Syria to make it completely Shiite or Alawite, or something absolutely ridiculous. And of course, no mention of the Uyghur terrorists that come from China, who have openly stated that they're trying to repopulate Syria with the Uyghur population, or no mention of the terrorists who've repeatedly said that they want to kill all of the Alawites and the Christians. No mention of that. But if you take literal terrorists and their families and move them over to Idlib, where they'll be much happier, they'll be with other terrorists and their families, and that's suddenly forced relocation, according to the BBC. So.
Yes, there was one fellow, we were looking at it, and the evacuations are so well organized, and they're almost courteous. They're so utterly professional between the Syrians and the Russians. They take people's possessions, they group them, they mark them very clearly, they carefully put them on the trucks and the buses for the people. The people are escorted to the buses, and these fighters to people about 1 in 7, something like that, to their families in ratio. But they are allowed to keep their personal weapons, and they are allowed to have them loaded. So literally, as you're watching this evacuation, you're seeing these guys get on these buses, and they have their AKs or shotguns, and you know that they're loaded. And one guy, and they tend to kind of lock eyes with you, and you have these stare-down contests with these guys. And one guy was looking at me, and he had his Al-Qaeda armband on. You're not going to convince me that these are poor little residents that have been forced to evacuate. This is the people of Homs were riddled to get rid of this infected thorn in their side.
Are you sure it was the Al-Qaeda armband or the white helmets?
Same thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was also a population swap, where the civilians were allowed to leave, allegedly going to be allowed to leave, and terrorists lured children onto the buses with chips and food,
Yeah.
and detonated a suicide bomb. And I don't remember how many people were killed in that, but it was a fairly sizable number.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Can I just comment on that for a minute?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because, I had witnessed that evacuation of Al-War done by the Syrians and the Russians. Well, we were in Aleppo, and we were and that explosion, that horrible massacre had occurred. This is when terrorists, Arar al-Sham and al-Nusra together, were evacuating these poor little, these Shiite villages that they had had under siege for years. And the government had finally arranged for those villages to be evacuated and brought safely, supposedly, to government areas. So the terrorists were in charge of that evacuation. They put those people on the buses. Those buses fit 40 people. They had 75 people per bus. They kept them on the buses for at least 2 days. It might have been 3 days. They were only giving them enough bread and water for about 20 people. So people were starving. They drove the buses instead of a straight route, which was very short. They took a 7-hour tour of various villages around Idlib, where the people in the buses, these Shiites who were getting evacuated, were tormented and abused and insulted by people, these terrorists in these villages in Idlib. Finally, they get to a point where they're going to start the journey through a kind of no man's land between the government areas and the terrorist areas. And that is why they brought a car up. It had a box of chips in it. The terrorists told men on the buses, bring your children here, we're going to give them a treat. Of course, by this time, the kids are starving. And they all gather around these boxes of chips, and there's bombs in the boxes, and they detonate those. I think 100 children died that day. 9 buses were destroyed. This was a massive evacuation with like thousands of people. But our group, the next day, those people were brought to the refugee center where we were in Aleppo, and we interviewed those survivors, and we interviewed the bus drivers that, we went on their buses and saw the damage of the ones that hadn't been utterly destroyed. And it was you mentioned the white helmets. We were asking these bus drivers, so were the white helmets there? Were they helping people? And the absolute blank stares were classic. They had no idea who we were talking about. That's true of most of the people in Syria. They've never heard or have never seen a white helmet because they only exist in Al-Qaeda areas, as you know. And I'll just never forget that look on their face of, what are you talking about? The white helmets are a total fabrication. Where they're at, they only help militants and fighters unless there happens to be a camera on them. Then they make a big show of helping some kid they've covered in dust or whatever. But that helped me that really confirmed for me that what an utter fabrication and propaganda tool the so-called white helmets are.
Yeah, and yet you live here and you think that the white helmets are led by Mother Teresa and they do nothing but put themselves at great personal risk to rescue children and give them candy bars. The explosion that we just discussed where the children were killed, you were in Syria when that happened, but being here and looking at the media, immediately mainstream media reports suggested that the Assad government, that the Syrian military had bombed the buses. The claims were, this is one of those situations where the claims aren't really clear because it's so idiotic. The Assad military, the Assad regime, because it's a regime. Saudi Arabia has a government, but Syria has a regime. Apparently we have a government too. They bombed people in buses who were supporting them. Makes a lot of sense. How has Assad managed to maintain power if he consistently bombs his supporters? Seems like by now he would have killed off all his supporters. He's been 6 years. He's had a pretty good go of it. But that's what was coming through the mainstream. That perhaps it was Assad. Eventually, they did have to admit that no, it was terrorists that did it, and maybe it's a war crime. But the original question was if you noticed a difference in Syria from the first trip that you took versus the last trip that you took in terms of the demeanor of the people, in terms of the situation of the government, the infrastructure, etc.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yes, I did notice a difference, and it's in the weariness. They're tired, particularly of the sanctions. They're tired of the lies. They're tired of nobody seeming to wake up. They had some optimism for during the election when Donald Trump was talking about Syria, working with Russia, giving up on trying to overthrow their government and their president, and just actually maybe focusing a little bit on maybe fighting some terrorists over there. And they had dubious optimism, cautious optimism, but they're all waiting to see what the actions would be. So the victory in Aleppo was huge. The Syrian army is making huge gains all around Syria. Of course, they recaptured Palmyra, etc. They're making great gains in Damascus suburbs. But when I was there, it was literally like a week after Damascus had experienced the terrible attacks that reminded them of like 2011. And so they were still kind of that was a hard time for people in Syria to see that. So what had happened was Saudi Arabia had paid the terrorists in Jobar $5 million to make a push to try to bust through the Syrian army lines. And there was terrible fighting. There had been the terrible suicide bombings in the courthouse and the cafe. Huge battles going on literally right on people's doorsteps as these terrorists were trying to bust through the lines. The streets of Damascus were empty for about a week. These are people, typically, the terrorists will fire mortars almost daily into Damascus, and people just go about their work and their lives. But during that week, they were, genuinely scared. And thank God for the Syrian army holding those lines, and they lost a lot of guys, but they held those lines, and the terrorists weren't able to break through. So what I'm saying is, it's very hard on the Syrian people, because as soon as the army is making these huge advances and it looks like the end is near, then something comes along, the West comes along with another false flag attack to justify some more crazy action in there, or Saudi Arabia, whoever, Turkey. And it's like this constant getting your hopes up and then having a backlash. And after 6 years, it's a kind of torture on these people. Like I said, they're still resolved. I was talking to one young girl, early 20s. She's a Christian girl in Damascus. And I was asking her, what do you think of your president, and et cetera. And she said, he's the most courageous man I know. He and his family have stayed here. They could have run away at any time with a blank check by Saudi Arabia, and he stayed here with his people. She said, as long as President Assad is here in Syria, I will stay in Syria. And I loved hearing those words, because it's difficult to stay there. The economy is shattered. It's hard to find work. It's hard to earn enough money to feed your family, etc. And yet, there still is that feel in their soul that they will not give up their country to these terrorists. They will not. No decent people on earth would do that. And they, in particular, that have that deep connection to their homeland, they will not stop defending their country. So the difference is probably more steel in the soul, more weariness in the eyes, and just this absolute resolve that they just want this over with.
Yeah, and that's again one of the things that you notice immediately when you talk to Syrians is their extreme love of their country. It's not fake patriotism, which is what I'm accustomed to, just sort of puffing out your chest and shoving a flag in somebody's face and just trying to recreate the war movie you saw. It's legitimate. It's real. It's a part of who they are, and it's clear. It comes out when you talk to them that they really have the blood of the land in their veins, and it's really impressive when you come across a group of people like that. The United States, obviously not just bombing Syria. We've gotten 8 in the last, ever since 9/11, we've got 8 countries that we're bombing. And as far as if I'm not mistaken, many of these populations are fairly young populations. They're not aging countries. This means that the United States for the last 10 years has been bombing people who are coming of age now and who will always remember the United States as the bomb droppers, the funders of terrorism, the people who killed their family members and destroyed their livelihoods. And we are creating an entire generation and an entire region, in fact, an entire generation of people across the world who will grow up hating America until the day they die. And we have sowed incredibly bad karma all across the world. So, I guess we're coming to an end of the interview, Janice, but anything else? Maybe you could tell us what's the reaction you've had when you get back and you try to tell people over here what you saw over there. Do your friends that knew you before the trips think you've completely lost your mind, or have you been able to get through to some of them, or what kind of results have you had? And if you've had results, please do share what you've told them, so maybe we could do the same.
Well, certainly, what we find, I think you're seeing it too, is this dreadful polarization. And I get that as well. So there'll be people who have open hearts, open minds, and then there are people that no matter how much proof and evidence you provide, they simply do not want to hear it. And, I've had friends literally say, I don't believe a word you're saying. And then other friends who are saying, I'm reading every word that you write. I'm researching this all. I can't believe this is going on, but I believe what you're saying. But what I find is, for the most part, when I've given talks and when I write, people here respond to the positive. They, as you said, they know nothing whatsoever about Syria. When I show them pictures of the beautiful green fields and the beautiful hotels that I stay at, the old Damascus homes, the ancient wonders, the beautiful castles that I've been in, when I show them the pictures of the Syrians and their faces, the look in their eyes and the smiles on their faces, when I share with them about not just the religious diversity and mutual respect, but the way women are treated there. They have basically equal rights there. They dress as I do. They are very strong, beautiful women, and, as you know, Syria has a woman vice president, a woman head of parliament, and they're business owners and and everything, professors, scientists, everything there. So when they see with their own eyes these pictures, these stunning photographs of the beauty of Syria itself and the people, that is what opens their ears and their eyes, and they begin to listen. And I think that it's important to focus on that because we need to introduce Syria as a country and a culture to the people in America who know nothing about it. And that's how we open the conversation, I believe.
That's a good point. I have found that if people are able to connect with others on a basic human level and see that they're not actually, knife-wielding aliens from another planet, that maybe you're not so inclined to want to kill them when you see that they're certainly much more in common than we have apart, with especially Syria. Well, Janice, how can... Well, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I wanted to say that, the bottom line is this. The Syrians want Syria for Syrians. They will choose their leader. They will choose their governmental system. They will choose their future. That is all they're asking. They said thank you, but no thank you to the United States, France, UK, Israel, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the Muslim Brotherhood, telling them who their leader can be. They said, thanks, we decide. And it doesn't matter what any American thinks of President Assad. What we think does not matter. What we think should happen in Syria does not matter. That is not our country. They've never threatened us, and they've never invaded another country under President Bashar al-Assad. They have the right to choose their own leader, and regardless of what anyone thinks, we have to focus on that primary message.
I agree, and I come across so many different people who will actually say, we should just leave people alone. If they're not threatening us, we should leave them alone. And to that, the Syrians would say, good, we're in agreement. Now go home.
Exactly. Get out of here. Come back as a tourist, not a terrorist. That's what they want.
Well, how can people follow your work? Because you put up a lot of photographs on social media. You talk about a lot of the discussions you've had with Syrians. What's the best way if people want to follow you from here on out to do that?
Yeah, the best way, really the only way right now, I do have a blog, but it's I need to update that, is on Facebook. Janice Kortkamp, JANICEKORTKAMP. I post about Syria daily, and I try to keep it simple. I try to keep it positive. It's hard sometimes. Sometimes I get into a bit of a sermonizing mode about what we're doing over there. But in general, I think they can find some good information there.
Well, good. I hope people start checking that Facebook feed out. I know I get a lot of good information from there, so definitely people need to go add you as a friend on Facebook and follow you there, and keep us updated if you get that blog updated. And I know you've got more stuff in the works, I'm sure. Not giving up on the Syrian crisis. So again, thanks for coming on the show tonight, and we'll have to have you back on soon.
Oh, thank you, Brandon. And I just want to tell all your listeners that everything that you've been writing and saying about Syria is right on, 100%. So appreciate and respect the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And we'll talk again soon.
Okay. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.
They told us to pack up our bags and head south. They said that the luck of the Irish ran out. They told us they burned down our farms and our stores. They cursed us for cowards and our wives for whores. I run down.
You are listening to UCY.TV. Why don't you stick around for more awesome radio?